Okay, so welcome everyone. So happy to be learning with you again today. This is the second class in the series on postmodern piety of Rav Shagar with Rabbi Zachary Truboff. Just a couple words. I know most of you have been with us before, but I'm going to be send invitations to become a panelist so that you can show us your smiling face or unmute if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. Also, when you're not actively speaking, we just ask that you stay muted so we can avoid having background noise, but you can feel free to unmute whenever you'd like to actively speak again. You can also participate in the class by writing a comment here on the chat box on Zoom, or as a comment on Facebook if you're watching us live there. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Truboff.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Evie. Let me just load this up here. Okay, so we are in our second session on the postmodern piety of Shagar. Today, tonight, depending on where you are, we're going to be looking at the topic of faith without illusions. And this is very much a continuation of last week's session and picks up on some of those themes. And hopefully we'll develop them a bit more fully. Just a bit of a recap from last time, as a way of sort of framing we're going to look at today. If you remember, we introduced the figure of Rav Shagar, and we particularly looked at how his experience during the Yom Kippur War was essential in shaping his religious outlook, his unique religious outlook. Part of what unfortunately made his experience during the war unique is that he was sent to the front, the Syrian front in the Golan Heights, the very early days of the war. When his tank reached the battle, essentially, they were immediately hit by enemy fire. And Rav Shagar's two close friends he knew from yeshiva from earlier in the army, were killed. Rav Shagar somehow manages to fling himself out of the tank, very seriously injured, but he survives. And it's that experience that has a profound impact on him, such that he describes in his recollections about the war that part of the change that he experienced was such that if faith is typically conceived as light, right? That's the classic metaphor used for faith, for God. Then Rav Shagar says after the war, his faith is light with darkness mixed into it. He calls it that it is better described as shade, right? That his faith is the shade. He turns to the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who articulates a notion of the halal hapanui, the empty space, the void. And the idea behind that Rabbi Nachman develops, that Rav Shagar really picks up on, is that when God creates the world, right, God has a problem. When God wants to create the world, God has a problem. And that is because God is Ein Sof, God is infinite, without end, how can there be a space for creation if God is God? So what happens, at least according to Luriana Kabbalah, is that God engages in an act of tzimtzum. God contracts God's self to make a space, an empty space for creation. Now, the problem with this, Rabbi Nachman argues, is that if creation can only exist in a space empty from God, then that kind of seems to imply that our experience of creation of the world can be one of God's absence. At the same time, Rabbi Nachman noticed that there can't be anything without God. God is infinite. And so the very idea of creation and God is in some ways a paradox. And part of that paradox means sometimes having to confront God's absence. There can't be creation without God's absence. And that creates questions, as Rabbi Nachman says, that don't have answers. And the questions that don't have answers are the questions that we face when we experience things like Rav Shagar did, the death of his two close friends in the Yom Kippur War. And lastly, we saw how for Rav Shagar, to say faith is like shade, like the shade of the sukkah. Well, the sukkah is a wonderful experience to be in, but as we all know, a sukkah can't even protect you from the rain, right? And faith is not something that guarantees you anything in this world, unfortunately. And to dwell in the shade of God, right? To have faith means that we're there in God's presence. We desire God because we love God. But again, it doesn't mean that it is always easy. It doesn't always make sense. And ultimately,
Rabbi Truboff, I am so sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a fairly bad sound today, and another person in the class had said the same. Is there any like other microphone or any way we can fix it?
Let me try one other thing. Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. I am so sorry for interrupting. I just want to make sure that people can understand.
I apologize.
Yeah. If there's anything else we can try just to make the sound a little better.
Just hold on.
Oh, that already sounded better to me. Just you saying, hold on.
Okay, can you hear me better now?
For me, yeah, significantly better. Much better.
We will try this. I just had to switch the whole monitor computer setup, but I think
it's way better. Okay, perfect.
I hope it'll work.
Thank you so much for doing this.
No problem. So so that was the introduction from last week. And we looked at last week, we contrasted Rav Shagar's response to the Yom Kippur War with that of Rabbi Yehuda Amital, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Tzion, who offered a different narrative after the Yom Kippur one in which faith wasn't really challenged in any way, because the Yom Kippur War could be understood as part of the unfolding narrative of redemption. The Jewish people's return to the land of Israel means Geula, redemption, is on its way. And once that path goes forward, there's no turning backwards. So at most, we can look at the war as a bump in the road, but the train to redemption continues onward. And even if we experience suffering, that suffering is only something which will ultimately be turned into salvation. Now, that kind of approach is in many ways problematic for Rav Shagar, though I should note that Rav Amital himself sort of backs off that later in life, and Rav Amital and Rav Shagar have a fairly close relationship. But there, I want to begin by looking at a piece that really helps us understand why Rav Shagar finds that approach so problematic. This notion of like a faith, a messianic faith that just overcomes all obstacles. Because for Rav Shagar, faith is something that can't just be inevitable, right? Faith is something that inevitably encounters doubt. And for Rav Shagar, it's the fact that our faith encounters doubt that is in some ways the proof that our faith is real in the first place. And the way that he gets at this is through analyzing a small piece of the Exodus narrative, a piece that you often not even aware of. To be honest, I'm not really sure I was aware of this until I read it in Rav Shagar. And what he's focusing on here is that after Moshe is sent by God to Pharaoh, he's sent by God to Pharaoh to request the Jewish people be set free for 3 days so they can worship God. Pharaoh, of course, says, no, not going to do that. And not only does Pharaoh refuse Moshe's request, Pharaoh goes on and makes the slavery even far worse for the Jews. And the Jews are now suffering even more. They've been suffering terribly up until now, and somehow it's actually managed to get worse. And when this happens, Moshe is just beyond himself. And he turns to God at the end of Parshat Shemot, and here's what he says. This is Rav Shagar first, but then the pasuk, right? The parsha ends in crisis, and it really does when you look at it. Like Moshe's like, oh my God, what is happening here? Everything started off so optimistically, triumphantly, and now everything is in flames. Moshe calls to God, why did you bring harm upon this people? Why did you send me, God? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has dealt worse with this people, and still you have not saved your people. Now, these words from Moshe, we look at them closely. And again, we often skip over this. Like oftentimes we're not even aware of this. But these are pretty harsh words directed at God, right? We often think of like, Avraham, challenging God when God says he wants to destroy Sodom. And oh my God, Avraham's so courageous. But like what Moshe says here is far sharper in a lot of ways, right? He's basically saying, like, God, what the heck is going on here? You're making things worse. You sent me for nothing. You're God. You're all powerful. Like, why haven't you saved your people? So it's a very, very harsh rebuke directed at God. And we have to understand ourselves, like, where is this coming from, and how should we ultimately respond to it? So here's what Rav Shagar says. And he's honest, right? When you read this rebuke, on a certain level, you have to recognize that in this moment, at least, Moshe Rabbeinu has lost faith in his mission.
and is developing a deep and shocking doubt about what is happening. And when we say, again, Moshe has lost faith in his mission, what Rav Shagar is saying is, like, if Moshe went into this thinking he's going to walk into Paro's office and do some miracles, and all of a sudden, the Jews are going to be going free and everything's going to be great, like Moshe now realizes that's not going to happen, right? Like, he really doesn't even know what's going to happen as this is going to play out. And Moshe is really having doubts, right? Like, who is this God? Like, maybe I shouldn't even trust him. Like, what am I even doing here? Where do we go with this? So Rav Shagar says we must again use the power of our imagination. The faithful shepherd, that's a reference to Moshe, not only has he not helped, rather he's done damage. As a result, Moshe had doubt about his mission and his abilities. It is as if he has come just to make things worse, right? Again, this is a moment of crisis. It's a moment of doubt. And what Rav Shagar goes on to say, which I think is profoundly, important, is he says these crises occur to every true believer, to every person that aspires to true goals and sees that sometimes reality slaps him in the face, contradicting his faith and goals. Right? This kind of crisis of faith that Moshe is happening, Rav Shagar is saying this happens to everyone. Right? If you take your faith seriously, you will inevitably reach a point in your life where you experience something, some reality, right, that negates what that faith is all about, the faith and the goals that you're trying to bring about with it. What Rav Shagar says is the very moment you have a crisis of faith, right, instead of seeing that as a weakness or a failure, that is actually a sign of true faith. It's a sign that your faith is real. Why? Because faith that does not fall is suspect of being false, because it is a faith that does not attempt to grapple with reality. It does not attempt to bring itself to expression in everyday life. For one whose faith is not real for him, it cannot fall. But one who grapples with reality often loses faith in their mission and abilities. This is what happened to Moshe Rabbeinu. So as I said, Rav Shagar is saying something very counterintuitive here. We typically think that the ultimate expression of faith is a faith that overcomes all odds, all obstacles. No matter what happens, one believes, they have emunah shlema, complete and perfect faith. However, what Rav Shagar is saying is the opposite is true. A faith that can never fall or never fail is not really faith at all. For faith to be real, it has to be connected to reality. It has to risk failure. If faith can never fail, it really doesn't have anything to do with reality at all. Faith must be able to come in contact with the world, which means it has to risk on some level being proven wrong. Because a faith that can never be disproven, that's always right no matter what, it's a faith that doesn't have any stakes. Like, it just doesn't. Like, whatever reality is, that, faith is just, one-dimensional in that way. But Moshe shows us, again, what real faith is supposed to look like. When that crisis comes, he questions God. He doesn't just say, which is, again, the typical from religious response you're supposed to have in this moment of crisis, it would be to say, well, what do I know, right? It's all in Hashem's hands and everything will be fine in the end. I'm sure, this didn't work out great, but, it's all part of God's plan for the Jewish people, for redemption. We shouldn't really worry about it, right? That's the sort of traditional from response. And that is certainly not Moshe's response. And according to Rav Shagar, right, that's not a response of really, faith at all. Now, to develop this idea, he cites a very interesting midrash that involves a debate. It's not even so much a debate, but two opinions, one by Rabbi Akiva, one by Rabbi Ishmael, who are often paired together in Midrashim. And here's what the midrash says. And what the midrash is trying to do is to understand the Moshe's stinging words. How could he say this to God? Is this justified? Is this not justified? The midrash recognizes, even though I'm not sure the typical reader does, is just how radical what Moshe is saying here. So what the midrash does is it struggles to understand how Moshe, the master of prophets, can ask a question like this to God. Why did you make things worse for the people? And Rav Shagar points out on this, there's a typical disagreement between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Ishmael says that when Moshe turns to God and says, you have still not saved your people, that is meant to be understood literally, vadai, right? This is typical of the approach of Rabbi Ishmael, who understands the Torah more literally. According to it, even Moshe Rabbeinu, who was at such a high spiritual level, is able to arrive to doubt such as this. This happens to everyone, to every true believer. One day they will fall into the dust. They will feel that everything they do is worthless and incorrect. So what this means here is that, again, when Moshe challenges God, Rabbi Ishmael is saying this is a real crisis of faith. This is literal. Like when Moshe says, "Why haven't you saved your people?" Right? It's reflecting a real sense of doubt, a real sense of uncertainty as to how this is going to play out. You shouldn't read this in any other way. It's real. That's Rabbi Ishmael's approach. And Rav Shagar is saying that's real for all of us, that we're going to have these moments. And the question is how we can respond. And can we respond like Moshe? For a truly frum person, it requires a certain courage and honesty and authenticity and sincerity to react as Moshe is reacting here, because you're not supposed to question God. Rabbi Akiva offers a similar approach, but a little bit different. Rabbi Akiva, this is Rav Shagar, as is his wont, does not explain it according to its more literal meaning. Rather, he interprets Moshe as saying, I know that you will eventually redeem them, the Jewish people, but what do you care about those stuck underneath the building? And Rabbi Akiva is getting at here, it's a rabbinic expression, but what he's saying is, God, I do believe the Jewish people are eventually going to be redeemed, but what about those who aren't going to make it? What about those who are going to die before the Jewish people get out of Egypt? What about those who've already died, right, before there's even a chance for redemption to begin, right? God, like, what are you going to do for them? So in this perspective, again, here's what Moshe is saying. Moshe Rabbeinu is not doubting again the redemption, right? This is a little bit of a shift. He knows the remaining Jews will be saved, but what about those that died, the ones underneath the building? This is Moshe's cry to God, and it's a terrible one. Rabbi Akiva actually goes on to say in the Midrash, in that moment, the divine attribute of justice requested to strike down Moshe, but because God saw that Moshe said such things on behalf of Israel, the attribute of justice did not strike him down. Meaning, when God saw that Moshe said this rebuke from a genuine place, God prevented the attribute of justice from striking Moshe. And Rav Shagar goes on to say these words, Rabbi Akiva's approach, are appropriate for the one who said them. Rabbi Akiva, the great lover of Israel, the one who rebelled, joined the Bar Kokhba revolt. If you know anything about Rabbi Akiva, he is one of the leading rabbis behind the Bar Kokhba revolt. He sees Bar Kokhba as the Mashiach. He basically, gives him that, that title. And yet Rabbi Akiva lives to see the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt and how the rebellion is crushed. And in a sense, Rav Shagar is saying, Rabbi Akiva felt like Moshe, right? Rabbi Akiva, on some level, would have had to have some crisis of faith when the rebellion was crushed, when thousands and thousands of Jews were being killed, when the Mashiach turned out not to be the Mashiach. However, Rav Shagar notes Rabbi Akiva did not lose his faith in redemption, right? He still believed redemption was going to happen, but where Rabbi Akiva would have felt it most strongly is what about those underneath the building who could not be redeemed? What about those who died, who suffered seemingly needlessly before redemption could ever come? Now, what's fascinating to me, Rav Shagar doesn't mention this here, but you cannot read Rabbi Akiva and not think about Rav Shagar's own narrative, right? Because it's almost as if Rav Shagar's words are in Rabbi Akiva's mouth here, right? Because if you remember Rav Shagar's own experience, right? He is a young, idealistic yeshiva student / rabbi. The war challenges him in a profound way with its traumas. Afterwards, his faith is there, but it is a faith again that confronts a reality that challenges it profoundly. And I know, and again, redemption is a very consistent theme in Rav Shagar's writings. He believes in redemption even after the war. There's no question of that it will happen. Maybe not through some historical process being led by the state of Israel, but again, it will happen. But nevertheless, what about those who died beforehand, who aren't going to make it, right? What about his friends in the tank who died in the war? Like, how and what way can God make it up to them? So when he puts this challenge in Rabbi Akiva's mouth, I mean, he feels it, he means it. This is clearly his own struggle with his own experiences during and after the war. But again, as we said, right, if faith can only be real if faith can fail. If faith encounters reality and it discovers that there are real challenges. A faith that can never fail is a faith that really has nothing to do with this with this reality at all. And perhaps the better term to describe it, the sort of problematic faith that's disconnected from the world, is an illusion. And what I want to do is I want to just spend a couple of minutes turning to a different thinker entirely, who I think does a masterful job capturing this dimension of faith that Rav Shagar finds so problematic, the way in which faith can be an illusion, the way in which faith can't be disproven, and how it is disconnected from reality. And to do that, I want to look briefly at a passage by Sigmund Freud from his essay/book, The Future of an Illusion. Freud writes a lot about religion, maybe not a lot, a significant amount about religion. But The Future of Illusion is a book that is dedicated entirely to a psychoanalytic understanding of the phenomenon of religion. And what's interesting, look, Freud, he embraces his Jewish identity, but he is an atheist. He's very open about that. He believes in science. And in this book, what he really argues for, I think carefully and thoughtfully and accurately to a certain extent, is the way in which religion is an illusion. Faith is an illusion. But we have to understand what he means when he says faith is an illusion, because it actually is a technical term. And I think it gets it very nicely, again, sort of what happens when faith is disconnected from reality. So here's what Freud says. He says, when I say that these things are all illusions, I must define the meaning of the word. What does it mean to say something's an illusion? He says, an illusion is not the same thing as an error, nor is it necessarily an error, right? So illusion and error are two separate things. So what's the difference? So he goes on to give an example of an illusion. He says, Aristotle's belief that vermin are developed out of dung was an error. So was the belief of a former generation of doctors that syphilis is the result of sexual excess. And so what Freud is saying here is that an error is when you just get it wrong. An error is when you think something is true and it's just not true. It's just like obviously not true in any way whatsoever. These were scientific beliefs that were just simply not true. They had nothing to do with reality. However, an illusion is different. An illusion is not just like an error in the sense that it is completely wrong. And he gives the example here. He says, on the other hand, it was an illusion of Columbus's that he had discovered a new sea route to the Indies. Right? If you know the story, Columbus sails west thinking he's trying to get to the Indies, and he finds his way to America. Now, Freud's point is that for Columbus to think that he had actually found a new route to the Indies, it was an illusion, right? Because again, Columbus did set sail in the direction of the Indies. Columbus did, find something that he could at least think was like that. It was just an illusion. It was just not exactly true. And here's Freud's point, is that what makes an illusion is that it is powered by a wish, right? He says here's what is characteristic of illusions: they are derived from human wishes. And he points out this actually makes illusions closer to psychiatric delusions. But his point here is that illusions need not necessarily be false, right? So when we say faith is an illusion, that's not meaning that like faith is automatically false. That is to say unrealizable and in absolute contradiction to reality, like Aristotle's belief or other false scientific beliefs. And he goes on to give an example of an illusion. He says, for instance, a middle-class girl may have the illusion that a prince will come and marry her. Now, the middle-class girl's belief that she'll marry a prince is an illusion. But what he means is this is possible, and a few such cases have occurred, right? Even in the British monarchy, there have been people who have been, married, people from lower classes. But it's still an illusion, because if a person believes that that's going to happen, they're not believing it because they have any evidence. They're believing it because they want it to be true, right? And that is what powers. That's what animates illusions, is that they cause us to think certain things are going to be true because we want them to be true. And in truth, illusions are always very present in our life, especially in the areas in which we most desire things to be a certain way, especially when it comes to things that matter most to us. So when it comes to love, or to our professional life, or some of our familial relationships, right? We have all sorts of illusions, because those are the areas where more than anything we want something to be a certain way, and we're willing to believe that they are a certain way rather than have to face the alternative. And Freud points out sometimes illusions are true, right? They can turn out to be true. He gives a sort of a strange example here, but we'll say that again, illusions can sometimes be true, The problem is that's not why we believe them. We believe them because we want to believe them. And he concludes here, thus we call a belief an illusion when a wish fulfillment is a prominent factor in its motivation. And in doing so, we disregard its relations to reality, just as the illusion itself sets no store by verification. And again, this last part here, again, is very, reflective of Rav Shagar, in the sense that, again, faith, which is a problem, is faith that can never be in crisis, right? Faith that is never negated by reality, faith that is just animated by the desire to believe because it's more comforting that way. And again, you see it here. It's a faith that can't be verified. It'll totally eludes verification. It has no stakes because it really doesn't have anything to do with reality at all. And again, what Rav Shagar is offering here, and in some ways, drawing on the same idea as Freud, is that much of what passes for faith in orthodoxy is an illusion, right? People believe things about God, Torah, the Jewish people, not because they are true, but because they want them to be true. Now, that doesn't mean they're inherently wrong, but it doesn't mean that faith really has anything to do with reality. And when your faith is powered by an illusion, what happens when you encounter something that contradicts it is that you have no choice but to deny it, or to repress it, or to explain it away, right? Exactly like Rav Amital did with the Yom Kippur War, right? Don't think it looks bad. Redemption is coming. But again, you encounter this all the time. I mean, unfortunately, you probably know in the news, there was this major earthquake in Turkey. Tens of thousands of people were killed. And in today, it became publicized that Rav Shmuel Eliyahu, who is the chief rabbi of Tzfat, is publishing an article that will appear in like the weekend, Shabbat-like pamphlets, where basically he says that the earthquake in Turkey is God punishing the Jewish people's enemies, right? And anybody who knows Torah, knows the history of the Jewish people, knows that God's enemies, the Jewish people's enemies, will be punished, just like the Egyptians drowned at the Red Sea. We just read it last week, right? We know Turkey hasn't always been the best to Israel, and therefore, right, they are finally getting their just deserts. Now, this is upsetting a lot of people, this whole thing that he wrote, because it's truly, religiously and morally, aberrant in my opinion. But again, what sits behind the faith of someone like Shmuel Eliyahu is this notion of certainty. It is a faith that cannot bear any doubt of being wrong, and therefore it's a faith that looks at the world and sees it as just reinforcing its own desires, its own wishes for how it wants the world to be. I mean, look, like we all want God to punish our enemies, like that's just human. And we all want to believe that when an earthquake happens and tens of thousands of people are killed, that there must be a reason for it. Being a true person of faith would mean recognizing just the limits of what that really can be. And this kind of faith, again, which is faith that is an illusion, faith that can't be like Moshe Rabbeinu and go to God and say, what the heck's going on here? That kind of faith is really, really problematic for Rav Shagar. I want to turn to a couple of more of Rav Shagar's writings that help us like flesh this out. Again, and what Rav Shagar is very concerned about, and we'll see it here, is the way in which faith becomes so certain, right, that it is both disconnected from the world and really becomes like an idol. And Rav Shagar offers this great story to kind of show us this faith that is disconnected from reality, this faith that is an illusion. So he says, I was once at a symposium about certainty and doubt. One of the speakers, a religious symposium, they have these kinds of things all the time, different topics. And he notes how one of the speakers mentioned that they had been at a particular forum where one of the participants had raised the possibility there could be a third Korban, right? He was at a forum, and again, they were saying, we returned to Israel, but we cannot be certain that, like, again, this is the end, that everything's going to be okay. Like, we have to be open to the possibility that perhaps the Jewish people will screw this up like they screwed it up 2 times before. Now, when this was raised at this other forum, the speaker notes how they threw the guy out for his heresy of placing doubt on the process of redemption that was supposed to have begun due to the establishment of Israel. And the speaker in the forum used this example to praise what faith should be. That faith should be certain, and then he viewed it as positive that the people in the forum were unwilling to hear arguments like these, and that the person saw this as true faith, right? And Rav Shagar is saying that Rav Shagar says like he was profoundly frightened like this. You threw the guy out because he was concerned that maybe, just maybe, Israel could lead to a third Horban. That people of faith, or people who proclaim they are people of faith, could think such a thing, and therefore we need to get rid of anybody who thinks otherwise, is a scary thing. And he says, I saw this as making an idol of faith, an expression of arrogant faith that cannot accept the other, which is the source of violence that reveals itself in religious discourse. Meaning, when this person was so certain about their faith that nothing could ever challenge it, they were going to get rid of anybody who would ever challenge it. At that point, Rav Shagar sees the worst of religiosity, right? The worst of faith being an illusion, the worst of faith having absolutely nothing to do with reality. Again, if you want to know whether or not somebody has a faith that's an illusion, well, as he says here, absolute certainty is usually one of the clearest symptoms. He says absolute certainty is a point of reference that gives the speaker confidence in the rightness of his path, but faith only occurs at the moment when a person gives up on certainty and becomes open to the possibility that it is not within the bounds of their understanding. This is a very powerful point, especially for me as a rabbi, that faith only becomes like possible when one is open to the possibility that it is not within the bounds of their understanding. And the reason I find this so powerful is, as a rabbi, I was a synagogue rabbi for a number of years, you are often called to be with people exactly at this moment, at the moment where neither you nor they can understand what the heck is going on here and where God is to be found here, or what God wants in this moment, and that you realize you're never going to know. I remember the very first shiva I went to as a rabbi, it actually took place a couple of days before I officially started, like I don't know, long time ago. It was a member of the shul, and I didn't even really know them yet. Their son had just died. He was probably 7 or 8 years younger than me at the time. It wasn't clear whether it was a suicide or a drug overdose. And this was my first, experience, my first encounter with the family. And I remember being at the funeral, at the grave, I didn't do the funeral, but I was there for all this. And I remember walking into the house for the shiva, and wanting more than anything to be able to offer some words of comfort to this family. I mean, the pain wasn't just etched on their faces; it was etched on their souls. I mean, this loss of their child, and that was a moment from the very beginning, which made me realize, what does it mean to be with people when you are at that place where faith is really not within the bounds of understanding. But at the same time, as Rav Shagar is noting, it's exactly that moment where faith becomes potentially real. And there's something very, very holy about those moments of crisis, even as difficult as they may be. He says, in this context, raising doubts is not the opposite of faith. Rather, it can bring us to real faith, right? And this, again, is we hear the echoes of the previous piece about Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu offers doubts to God. He reveals his doubts, but that doesn't push him away from faith. That is what actually can make faith possible. The raising of doubts is not necessarily an educational goal. Meaning we're not looking to find doubts, to create doubts, to be overly critical. We don't need to do that because it will come. It will always come. And it is not my intention, he says, to say that there is a need to nurture skepticism, primarily because there are people who remain in a chronic condition of doubt and are unable to escape from it. Meaning we don't need to put ourselves there. It will come, though. But on the other hand, there's a danger in cultivating baseless religious certainty. The trap of being over-ideological can lead to behavior like idolatry, which cover up their approach with words of faith, right? Once your faith is turned into an idol, once it is certain, once you can't raise any doubts, once you can't tolerate not even your own doubts, but the doubts of anybody else, right? You have to throw them out, like in Rav Shagar's story. That is when you know, as I said, faith is an idol, and at that point, faith is deeply problematic. It's not real faith at all. It's an illusion that has become a fully embodied idol, and that's always a moment where very scary and dangerous things can happen. I'll note here that just again this week's Parsha Yitro. There's a beautiful teaching by the Messianism, which expresses exactly what Rav Shagar is sharing here, and I'm sure Rav Shagar knew this particular teaching. He doesn't cite it, but he's almost hinting to it outright. And what the Meshiloach Hasidic Rebbe, Ishbitzer Rebbe, what he notes is something unique about the first two 10 commandments. Right, the first commandment is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. Right, and the second commandment is make any idols of me. Right, and the Ishbitzer Rebbe wants to understand what is exactly going on with these two commandments, and he offers a very interesting interpretation. He says, when the Torah states Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the verse does not say Ani Hashem Elokecha. Right, it doesn't say Ani; it says Anochi. Those are two separate words, but they kind of mean the same thing. And the Ishbitzer is going to know what the difference might be. It says the verse does not state Ani. For if it stated Ani, that would imply that the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed then the totality of His light to Israel, precluding the possibility of further delving into His words. Meaning, if God said Ani Hashem Elokecha, it implies that God made God's self fully present in that moment of revelation. That whatever Jewish people experienced, they experienced the totality of God. Right? They got it all at that moment. Anochi implies, however, that there was some experience of God, but it was not total. It was lacking in some way. It was not a complete revelation in which everything was revealed. And he says the letter Kaf of Anochi denotes that the revelation is not complete. Right? The language is Kaf adimayon. Right? Like if you put Kaf in front of words, it means like. Right, and so essentially, what God is saying when He says "Anochi Hashem Elokecha," He's saying not "I am the Lord your God." He's saying whatever you're experiencing right now, it is like me, the Lord your God, but it is not me in my totality. Right, because that is something you Jewish people, as you human beings, you cannot experience. Right, as God says to Moshe, "Lo yareni adam v'chai," right? No man may see me and live. Right, we can experience something, but we never get it all, and that is very challenging. Because we want to believe when we experience revelation, we got it all. We got God. We know exactly what God wants. And now we're going to go out and do it. And the Ishbitzer's point is that the second commandment comes to reinforce this idea that we didn't get it all, that we don't fully understand God. We never will fully understand God. He says the reason that the commandment of thou shalt not make for yourself a graven image follows the first commandment is because a graven image is cut according to specific dimensions. It's perfect, lacking nothing, right? What makes an idol is that its form is fixed. It is what it is. You can see it, front, back, top, bottom. You see it in its entirety, in its totality. That's what makes an idol. But the very fact that we can't make an idol of God means that, again, we cannot know God in God's totality, in God's detail. And as he says here, this is to teach us that nothing is revealed to man completely. Whatever we know about God, we never know it all. And that is difficult because that inevitably means that we encounter doubts, that we encounter uncertainty when it comes to God. And the challenge is being in a relationship with God where those doubts are real, where that uncertainty is real. And again, the reason we know it's so hard is because we experience it in our own lives with everyone that we love, right? To love somebody is always to make oneself vulnerable, to open oneself up to uncertainty, because as much as we may love them, we are not them, and we don't get to control them. We don't get to control who they are today, and we certainly don't get to control who they are tomorrow. We can think we know what they want, but every spouse and every parent learns very quickly that they never truly know what the other wants. And if they think they do, that usually means some level of violence on the other, right? If somebody asks me that, whether or not they want to make Shabbat plans with my family, if I say, well, wait a second, I know exactly what my wife wants, I don't even need to ask her, and I say yes, right? You learn pretty quickly in a marriage, that's probably not the right way to go, right? You cannot speak for others because in truth, none of us ever really truly know others. And we have to live with that, the uncertainty and the doubts that always emerge around that. So the question that becomes is again, how do we like learn to deal with this, to live like this, in which that our faith isn't certain, that our faith has doubts, and even though that makes it real, it certainly doesn't make it easy, right? There are many rabbis here, many Orthodox rabbis in Israel and elsewhere who have faith that is certain. There is nothing they will ever face in the world that will ever challenge their faith. That's what they'll tell you, at least. But again, that kind of faith is not the kind of faith that Rav Shagar wants. And I don't think that's the kind of faith that any of us should want. But then we're still left with trying to understand, what does it mean to live with a faith that is real, that encounters real doubts? So here's what Rav Shagar says. He says, it is important to remember that an answer like maybe is an actual possibility in existence, which can be as certain as certainty. Right? Rav Shagar is saying here is that faith is not supposed to be certain, right? Faith is built on maybes. Faith is built on uncertainty, right? The existence of a positive option itself changes the feeling in life. The fact that I know something is possible is not just like a good thing, a nice thing. The fact that I know something is possible, it can potentially change everything about my life, right? For example, it doesn't need to be good for me in the simplistic sense in order to believe, right? I don't just have to believe because I know it's going to be good for me, right? Because I know good things are going to come to me if I do mitzvot. He says it is enough for me to believe that it can be good. Maybe it'll be good. That this is a potential possibility in order to feel the divine presence. Faith is not necessarily certainty. So it is possible that a faithful answer to the question of whether there is a creator for the world will be maybe, right? Again, it's not the typical traditional answer that we expect, but Rav Shagar is saying there's something very powerful about a maybe, something very, very powerful about a maybe, and that maybe all faith at best can be just a maybe. He says, in this respect, the presence of faith in the world depends on human beings, on their willingness to accept the existence of God in this world, despite the uncertainty. Right, that as I said, all faith is sort of built on a maybe. All faith is mixed with doubt. And again, we saw this with Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not like, again, Rav Shagar is being so modern or radical here, right? To a certain extent, we know Moshe has faith in God in the sense that he believes in God's existence. But Moshe has absolutely no certainty, absolutely no complete faith about where things are going or what his role is in that or what God really wants and how it's going to happen. Even if we are blessed with absolute certainty of God's existence, which most of us are certainly not, we don't even get that, we still have no certainty whatsoever about what God wants or why God does what God does, right? That's Moshe's problem, which means that is all of our problems. But nevertheless, a maybe is something real. It's often all that we really have. There are never certainties in life. And if you want, if you want certainty in life, right, that's the sort of illusion of faith. If you want that, well, then never leave your home, right? Like, don't go out in the world because the world is full of uncertainties, right? If you want certainty, don't get married. If you want certainty, don't have children. Because again, being in the world, being in relationship with others means making yourself vulnerable, means learning to live with lots and lots of doubts. But again, that doesn't take away our love for those that we care about most, but it does make it more complicated. Shagar goes on here, and he offers a sort of a Hasidic story as a way of getting at this idea that faith can be built on a maybe. He says this is a very deep point of faith, which emerges from the following story of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, famous Hasidic Rebbe, student of the Maggid of Mezrich. And Rav Levi Yitzchak invited into one of his homes, one of the enlighteners, a maskil. Those who were, people used to be weren't religious anymore, and were often fierce critics of religion. But Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev is famous for being a great lover of all Jews. Religious, not religious, didn't matter. So he invites the maskil into his home. And again, like a lot of maskilim, this was somebody who knew a lot of Torah. And the visitor is described in the stories as a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, somebody who knows a lot of books, but at the same time, they are now an unbeliever. They don't have faith. And therefore, this guy goes around arguing with rabbis and trying to offer questions that undermine the rabbi's faith and proofs, and gets into debates with them. But here's how Rav Levi Yitzchak handles it. When the man enters the house, he sees Rav Levi Yitzchak walking and sitting in the room with his wondrous devotion, his dveikut, his great enthusiasm. He's immersed in some sort of spiritual connection with God. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's appearance was very awesome. And he sees Rabbi Levi Yitzchak speaking to himself, to his soul, saying, perhaps this matter is as true as been said. Perhaps the matter is as true as has been said. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak keeps repeating this to himself many times. Perhaps the matter is as true as has been said. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak doesn't look at the visitor at all. And the visitor was kind of in stunned silence here and didn't know what to think. And actually becomes kind of afraid, right? What is the rabbi doing? This is sort of strange. What's going on here? He's in this holy moment, but what does it mean? Finally, the rabbi sees him and he approaches him and he says to the man, he says, listen, my son, it is impossible to show heaven and hell on the table. What he means is it's impossible for me to show you heaven and hell. I can't make it appear to you. And what is the point if I do this, right? For I myself cannot show you clearly. I can't convey it to you in absolute terms that will make you believe it. I can't do that. But please listen, my son. Perhaps the truth is as written in the Torah, right? As we were saying before, perhaps. We have to be open up to that possibility of perhaps, that possibility of maybe. Remember, my son, the great danger hovering over your head. Maybe the truth is yes, and if so, how will you escape it, right? At the end of the day, all we ever have are maybes. And we have to learn how to be willing to stake our life on a maybe. I mean, this happens. Like I said before, I'm going to use the example of love, people we love the most, right? At a certain moment in every relationship, when people have been together for some period of time, they're dating or whatever, at some point, somebody needs to say, I love you, right? And what makes it so scary and so difficult is somebody's got to say it first. And whoever says it first doesn't know what the other person is going to say in response, right? To say I love you to the other is always a moment of maybe. It's always leaping into the maybe, because you have no idea if they're going to say, I love you back. And again, the things that matter most to us in life are always, built on maybes. That's what makes them scary, but that's what actually makes them real. And Rav Shagar goes on to say, he says, indeed, from conversations with Baalei Tshuva, I came to see that what changed the lives of many of them was not the certainty about religion, but the possibility, the maybe, which was accepted as a real option that excited them and gave them a sense of liberation and redemption. Goes back to Rabbi Leviatz's story, saying, I can't make you believe in God. Nobody can make another person believe in God. All I could do is ask you to be open to the possibility of the maybe, right? That a maybe can change your life. Because as I said, all we have ultimately are maybes. He says this feeling itself was for them proof of the truth, which is the root of this maybe, of this possibility. From here on, all that remains for them is to complete the process of tshuva, right? People become Baalei Tshuva, people are willing to embrace religiosity, not because they know it's true, but because they see that there is something there that might be able to change everything, even if they don't exactly know what that is. Now, Rav Shagar concludes this piece by adding as follows. He says, I'm going to read it. I'm not sure it's on the screen here, but I'll read it anyway. He says, faith is indeed certainty, especially when we're talking about the existence of God, and that is literally true. However, what can lead to belief is actually the doubt, because language makes us give a definition to the phenomenon, and thus, instead of touching the phenomenon, we are satisfied with defining it externally. He says the problem, again, with faith is an illusion, is it wants to treat things as abstractions. It wants to give a definition, say this is what faith is, and that definition will always be the same. It's never going to change, right? He says doubt, however, comes to reopen language, to prevent rigidity and allow us to experience reality anew, right? Doubt actually can cause us to look at things differently, offer new interpretations of things, to see new meaning in things, sometimes in the things that matter most to us. And we need doubt to open things up for us. He says, if we come and say, yes, of course, there is a God, then this statement may close the possibility that at some point there will ever be a revelation. Meaning, again, if we are absolutely certain about our faith, that actually may close us off to the very notion of experiencing God. It's a very radical thing to say. If you have too much faith, you will never actually know God. He says, rather, the ability to answer maybe in relation to religious life creates a space that may create the sudden possibility of revelation, right? It is actually the maybe, the having of doubts, that doesn't distance you from God, but actually makes an encounter with God possible, because you're no longer living in illusion, right? If you're no longer living in an illusion, then you might actually be able to experience something real. And I'll just conclude by offering another angle on this, one that is offered by Franz Rosenzweig, who I think picks up on this idea very, very nicely in Rav Shagar. And he's not, Franz Rosenzweig, great German Jewish philosopher. He lives, decades and decades before Rav Shagar. But Rav Shagar is saying something that is very similar, and I want to just put it in Rosenzweig's terms. because again, Rav Shagar studied Rosenzweig, and Rosenzweig has a particular way of words that I know Rav Shagar appreciated, and I do too. Franz Rosenzweig himself is a Baal Tshuva. He returns to the Jewish tradition. He returns to God, Torah, and the Jewish people. It's not a simple thing for him. It's not an act of pure, certain faith. I can guarantee you that. And many of the people around him, the Jews around him, are struggling with his decision. They can't really fully understand it. And he has a close friend, Rudy Hallow. And Rudy is always like ambivalent about faith, right? Franz has embraced it, but Rudy is always ambivalent. Rudy's like ambivalent about everything. He's uncertain about everything. He's one of those figures that Rav Shagar said, like, can find their way stuck into doubt and skepticism, and they can't find their way out ever. And Rudy is telling Franz about how he's planning to go to a particular German city and spend some time there. And he's hoping some good things will happen while he's there. But Rudy is so anxious about it and already like trying to plan it 10 steps out that Franz is like, very concerned. And basically, again, he tells Rudy Hallow that Rudy's so worried about his future. He's so worried about the uncertainties of the future and trying to plan ahead to account for them that Rudy won't ever let the present happen, right? Which is a very interesting idea, that our faith needs to be certain for us, and we're doing everything we can to make it certain, then we can't even experience the here and now. And Franz says to Rudy in one of his letters, he says, you can't ask God for miracles. Like, we as Jews are not supposed to ask God to make just like miracles happen for us. You're not supposed to pray outright for a miracle. But here's what Rosenzweig says. He says, but it is possible and required to make a space for it. And here's what he says. He says, the one who thinks about the moments after the closest moment silences the outstretched hand of God for the act of the miracle. So what does Rosenzweig mean by this? That if you're always looking for the moments after the moment, you actually silence God's outstretched hand for the act of the miracle. So here's the thing, right? If you need faith to be certain, if you're living in that illusion, then the certainty that faith offers is always about some magical future, somewhere far down the line. Faith that is absolutely certain does not allow you to be open to the moment. It doesn't allow you to be vulnerable. It doesn't allow you to be, as we said, to be proven wrong, to face doubts, to face challenges, to experience contradictions. But here's the thing, right? To open yourself up to the here and now and not always be looking for the moment after the moment means opening ourselves up to doubt. But it also means opening ourselves up to life with all of its unknowns and all of its uncertainties. And as Rav Shagar frequently said, God is a God of truth because God is a living God. Right. And then again, if you want God to be true, then again, God has to be a living God. If you want your faith to be true, then your faith has to be a living faith. It actually has to be connected to the world. It has to be a faith that is alive and doesn't want to be an illusion and is willing to accept all the doubts, all the uncertainties that ultimately accompany it. But only if we can live that kind of faith, the faith that embraces doubts, the faith that it actually like exists in reality, then we actually have the opportunity of maybe actually experiencing something real, and maybe even being surprised enough to experience something that we're willing to call divine. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to open up to some questions. I see there's one in chat, but let me just see if anybody else has any questions before I'll address the one in the chat.
Jennifer, did you have a question? Maybe not.
Okay, so let me read the one in the chat. Does Rav Shagar lay out any limits to the illusions that we may harbor? Is there a difference between a middle-class girl who hopes she will marry a prince versus a middle-class girl who hopes she will be abducted by an alien? Can we also say maybe that she's around? So here's the thing. The line between, for Freud at least, between an illusion and a delusion is not always so clear, right? Like that's part of the challenge. Rav Shagar is saying that, again, we don't know. There's no objective measure for this. The only way we can tell is and again, this is what we've been saying, right, is the extent to which reality can cause us to question our faith, right? The challenge of faith is how we maintain it through the doubts, right? But at the same time, if we never experience doubts, if nothing can ever contradict it, then clearly that is a faith that is just an illusion. And what we're going to pick up exactly on this point next time is, again, I know I'm trying to make the argument that faith is only alive when it can experience doubts, But the flip side of that is we all know how much doubts can destroy faith, right? Like, how is it then that one holds on to faith when faith seems impossible, right? How is it that Rav Shagar held on to faith after his friends died? How is it, again, I use this example, and Judith, mentioned this to me in an email. One of the most profound experiences for me as a shul rabbi was having lots of Holocaust survivors in my shul. I was blessed to have a lot of Holocaust survivors in my shul. And these were people who went through the absolutely unimaginable, and they still came to shul every Shabbos, right? Like, you haven't lived until you've seen somebody on Shabbos morning, like an 85-year-old man or woman practically be in tears telling you about some of their experiences. And yet there they are, like davening Musaf. Like, there is something truly profound to be able to experience that, because you realize in those moments, again, they'll be the first to say, like, the Holocaust survivors, at least in my shul, their faith was not illusion, right? They were never going to offer you explanations about why is it that this happened? Why is it they were saved? Why is it their family was killed, right? That was, for me, what was so obvious. What they were left were challenges and even doubts. But the fact they still came to shul, the fact they still said the words of prayer, the fact that Torah still meant something to them, the fact that God still meant something to them, is what showed me that their faith was real and not an illusion. Because, as I said, they could recognize, they could embrace there was real contradictions there. And at the same time, like I said, next week we'll get in a bit more about what does it mean to say faith can hold itself in those moments of doubt and uncertainty when it is challenged. But again, that enables it to still feel like it is something profoundly real. Any other questions?
Okay, I see no more questions. No more questions on Facebook as well. I'll give it one more minute.
Sure.
Danielle, do you have a question? No. Okay. Thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff. And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us today. Always nice to see familiar faces and also new faces. Just as a quick reminder that we have our Talmud Shiur with Dr. Shana Sheik starting next Monday. Hope to see you there. And as always, we have many classes happening, so you can go on our website, www.drisha.org, to find more information and also to register. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Lehitraot. Thank you again, Rabbi Truboff.
And when you hear the Aseret Dibros, remember, like, as clear as it may sound, we never know what God wants. Anybody who tells you they know exactly what God wants, those are always the people you got to be the most concerned about.
Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you. It was wonderful.